Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Ryan, and I'm a partner in Thompson Hine's Employee Benefits and Executive Compensation Practice Group. Today, I'm joined by my partner in that same practice group, Ed Redder, as well as the head of institutional consulting for Clearstead, Mike Shebeck. I welcome you to today's webinar. This is the first in a series of webinars hosted by Thompson Hine's ESG Collaborative. The session today will be discussing navigating the intersection between ESG and ERISA. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. Today's program is being recorded, and we will send a link to all individuals that registered for the program within 48 hours of today's presentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to use the question box located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen to submit questions. We'll try to address questions as we go. If there's time remaining at the end, we will address questions at the end. And if there are questions we don't get to during the webinar, we will follow up through email. We will also be offering CLE for today's webinar. Please be sure to complete the online survey confirming your attendance at today's program. You can find the link in the agenda, which can be downloaded from the handouts tab. In the handout panel, you can also download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and bios for today's speakers. Again, thank you for your interest. And if you have any questions as we go along, please use the question box. Without further delay, I'm going to hand this over to my partner, Ed Redder, to kick off the discussion.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be with everyone here today. So today, as Laura mentioned, we're discussing the intersection between ESG and ERISA. And so just quick discussion of our agenda. First, I'm going to cover rules and regulations that impact this discussion. Next, I'll hand the baton over to Mike, who will talk about trends and options from his perspective. And then finally, we'll shift to Laura, who will talk about external factors and pressures. So let's jump right into it. I know our time is tight, and I want to move you along through the rules and regulations and get you to the more interesting topics towards the end. So first of all, the rules and regulations. So when we talk about the intersection between ESG and ERISA, obviously we have to first talk a little bit about ERISA and what is ERISA. Many of you on the call today may already know this. This may be simplistic, but for those who don't, I do want to give some background and context for the discussion. So ERISA is the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. It's a federal law that provides kind of a comprehensive set of rules that govern various aspects of employee benefit plans. And among employee benefit plans are employer-sponsored retirement plans. So think of a 401k plan, think of one of your defined benefit plans or a pension plan that your company sponsors. Those are all subject to ERISA. And under ERISA, one of the kind of fundamental rules is that every plan that's subject to ERISA has to have at least one named fiduciary who has the authority to manage the operation and administration of the plan. And so within that management and within the operation and administration of the plan, one important aspect of that operation and administration is to select investments for the plan and to monitor those investments within the plan. So let's talk about some of the basic ERISA fiduciary standards and obligations that are imposed on ERISA fiduciaries. So every ERISA fiduciary must discharge his or her duties with respect to a plan solely in the interest of the participants and their beneficiaries. So for instance, a fiduciary couldn't subordinate the interests of the participants and the beneficiaries to an interest of the company, for instance, or their own individual interests. And again, it has to be managed for the exclusive purpose of providing benefits to the participants and their beneficiaries and defraying reasonable expenses of administering the plan. And so finally, though, we also have the fiduciary standard of care, which says a fiduciary has to act with the care, skill, prudence, and diligence under the circumstances then prevailing that a prudent expert acting in a like capacity and familiar with such matters would use in the conduct of an enterprise of a like character and with like aims. So this is pretty widely recognized as among the highest standards of care under the law. And so ERISA fiduciaries, those who are in that management role or administering the plan, have very high standards to live by. And so how does that play into ESG factors and investments that may consider ESG factors? Well, there's long been a concern on the part of the Department of Labor, and the Department of Labor has jurisdiction over fiduciary aspects of employee benefit plans, that ESG investing, when we take into consideration some factors that serve some goal or end that's collateral to the performance of the investments, that it could be viewed as inconsistent with ERISA's duty of loyalty. So kind of stepping back, right? If I have to act solely in the interest of the participants and beneficiaries, then how can I take into consideration, how can I try to serve some other collateral benefit outside of the plan, extrinsic to the plan? So it's been a really difficult topic for the Department of Labor, and as you'll see here in the slide, they've really been wrestling with that issue, the potential promotion of interests that are outside of the plan for years. And so I've listed here on this slide a number of pieces of sub-regulatory guidance that the Department of Labor has issued, dating back into the 90s and even earlier than that, in some contexts, and moving on and through time all the way up until 2018. So we've had this flurry of sub-regulatory guidance. Unfortunately, though, the guidance has caused, I think, a lot of confusion in the industry, and that's really because the guidance has shifted tone over time, right? It seems that during certain administrations that the guidance has embraced the potential consideration of ESG factors and other collateral factors, and at other times has gotten very cold with respect to the ability to take into consideration these factors. And so it's been this kind of swinging pendulum from administration to administration over the years. So clarity has been lacking for a long time. Then fast forward, in November of 2020, the Department of Labor finalized a rule titled Financial Factors in Selecting Plan Investments, which then became effective January 12th, 2021. And according to the rule, the selection of investment options to serve non-pecuniary interests raises fiduciary concerns under ERISA. And so if you just take that at a high level, you'd say, okay, well, we already kind of knew that from the basics of ERISA under Section 404 that we just previously discussed. But this really kind of focused on this particular issue. And so the rule at a high level said that an ERISA fiduciary has to evaluate investments solely on pecuniary factors and not subordinate plan participants and beneficiaries' pecuniary interests to achieve non-pecuniary goals. So interestingly, the final regulation doesn't mention ESG specifically, but it's very clear from the context that that was the target of the Department of Labor at that time. And so what is a pecuniary factor? Well, it's one that a fiduciary prudently determines is expected to have a material effect on the risk and or return of an investment based on the appropriate investment horizons consistent with the plan's investment objectives and funding policy. And so it really focuses the inquiry on, is this a factor that affects the performance or risk, right, of an investment, and not taking into consideration any kind of non-pecuniary, read ESG factors. There was an exception, a pretty narrow exception for tiebreakers, right? So if a plan fiduciary is unable to distinguish between two investments based solely on pecuniary factors, so think about that. The investments have to be indistinguishable based on pecuniary factors, those, right, that have a material impact on performance or risk. The fiduciary could use non-pecuniary factors. But the Department of Labor made the fiduciary jump through several hoops. One, you have to explain, you have to document why pecuniary factors alone were insufficient. You have to document how the selected investment varies from alternatives. And then third, you have to document how the non-pecuniary factors used are consistent with the participants and beneficiaries' interests. So while providing this very narrow possibility, they did put a lot of conditions and requirements on the application of this tiebreaker exception. So when we step back for a minute and talk about the high level that we've just discussed, it really appears that there are two paths for the possible inclusion of ESG funds in a plan. ESG factors are determined to be pecuniary in nature, so they actually do have a material impact on the performance or the risk and return of an investment, or through application of the tiebreaker rule. But not to be the final word, in the preamble to the rule, the Department of Labor strongly cautioned that fiduciaries can't too hastily conclude that ESG-themed funds may be selected based on pecuniary factors or are not distinguishable based on pecuniary factors. So really threw some cold water on this and clearly targeted these types of funds. And in the Department of Labor's view, really should be looked at or considered pretty infrequently based on the guidance. A couple of other rules that were set out in the final rule. First, the rule also provides an investment can't serve as a plan's qualified default investment alternative if the investment's objectives, goals, or principal investment strategies include, consider, or indicate use of one or more non-pecuniary factors. So target date funds, right? QDIAs. So if a participant doesn't actively select their own investment, many plans have a default investment that people end up in. So this is saying for those purposes, and they're pretty broadly used, particularly with plans that have automatic enrollment, a lot of the assets of the plan go into these qualified default investment alternatives. So really imposes a pretty strong or significant restriction on ESG consideration of ESG funds. So in sum, really the rule has been viewed as having a very quite a chilling effect on ESG investing within retirement plans. But as we noted, the rule became effective January 12th, 2021. And we know right after that, the administration changed. President Biden took office 8 days later, and almost immediately, or actually the same day as the inauguration, issued Executive Order 13990, where the president directed all the agencies to consider any of the past administration's regulations and determine whether they were inconsistent with the goals of promoting public health and environment. Soon after that, the Department of Labor issued a non-enforcement policy, essentially saying they were not going to enforce this new rule, the final rule that we just discussed, until further guidance is issued. So they were going to reevaluate the rule and consider changes. So that leads us to the last piece of guidance, right? The proposed rule. So last October, almost a year ago, the Department of Labor issued a proposed rule, which will again alter the analysis. So continuing on this swinging pendulum theme. So the proposal completely eliminates the concept of pecuniary versus non-pecuniary factors, and instead says that a fiduciary, can meet their investment prudence duties if the fiduciary gives appropriate consideration to those facts and circumstances the fiduciary knows or should know are relevant to the investment or investment course of action, and then acts accordingly. And what is appropriate consideration? It includes a number of factors, but one of which is consideration of the projected return of the portfolio relative to the funding objectives. And the Department of Labor here proposed pretty strong language, and that it indicated, and this is right along the ESG themes, which may often require an evaluation of the economic effects of climate change and other environmental, social, or governance factors on the particular investment or investment course of action. So again, in the preamble, the Department of Labor talks about this and says, listen, we wanted to make clear, we viewed the final rules having a very chilling effect on the use of ESG factors. And so we were trying to reverse that trend, right? We wanted to indicate that you may have to, right? In order to give appropriate consideration to investments, you may have to consider these types of factors in selecting an investment. I think even maybe more notable is that the proposal also provided that fiduciary may consider any factor in the evaluation of investment that, depending on the circumstance, is material to the risk-return analysis, and then gave very specific examples. Again, not an exhaustive list, but a list of important examples that, again, the Department of Labor viewed as counteracting kind of the chilling effect of the final rule. And they specifically listed climate change-related factors, governance factors, and workforce practices. And so, again, pretty strongly swinging the other way. You may have to, for appropriate consideration, evaluate certain factors. And then if these factors are may impact or may be material to the risk return analysis, you can always consider this. But it's even broader than that, right? You can always consider factors that have material impact on the risk return analysis of funds. Moving to the fiduciary's investment loyalty duties, remember, acting in the sole interest of the participants and beneficiaries. The rule really just reiterated kind of rules that have been known for a long time. Fiduciary can't subordinate the interests of the participants and beneficiaries under the plan to another objective, and can't sacrifice returns or increase risk to promote benefits and goals unrelated to the interests of the participants in the retirement income or financial benefit. However, the evaluation of investment must be based on risk and return factors that the fiduciary prudently determines are material to the investment value over appropriate time horizons. But again, this common theme of trying to counteract the chilling effect, the Department of Labor, the proposed rule says, whether a factor is appropriate depends on the individual facts and may include climate change related factors, governance factors, and workforce practices. And so, again, we have this common theme within the proposal of expressly and specifically identifying certain ESG factors and how they may be used in the evaluation of funds. Now, let's go back to the tiebreaker. We noted a pretty narrow tiebreaker under the current final rule. The Department of Labor revised the tiebreaker as well. And now, at least under the proposed language, it says a fiduciary, after analysis, if they determine that competing investments equally serve the financial interests, as opposed to the old rule or the current rule, which are that they're indistinguishable, the fiduciary may select the investment based on collateral benefits. Now, if the investment is a designated investment alternative, the fiduciary must ensure that the collateral benefits, QDIA, the fiduciary must ensure that the collateral benefit characteristics are prominently displayed in disclosure materials. So again, if there are stated collateral benefit characteristics of a fund, we have to prominently display those. So where are we now? So we know we have the final rule that's in place. We know that the Department of Labor is not enforcing it. They issued the non-enforcement policy soon after its issuance. We also have received, the Department of Labor has received a lot of comments on the proposal. And we just don't know when the rule might be finalized. It's just uncertain at this point. We have an election coming up. Whether that cuts in favor or against adopting the rule sooner rather than later is uncertain as well. And so where we're left is kind of this murky area. We know the final rule is in place, it's on the books. We know the Department of Labor is not enforcing it, and we don't know when the final rule will come out. So based on all of that, it seems that really practitioners, fiduciaries, should be exercising caution and restraint in this area. Now, are there ways to use ESG factors and consider ESG factors that could be consistent with both the final rule that's on the books and also the proposal and what we anticipate will be the final proposal or the final rule? Yes, I think there are. But again, we need to exercise caution. We need to act as prudent fiduciaries. And with that, you have kind of an overview of the rules that are in place right now. And so I think it's time to shift to Mike from Clearstead, Mike Sheback from Clearstead, who will kind of look into trends and options. Mike?
Ed, thank you. That was a great summary, and it's certainly been back and forth on a lot of different rules and how to interpret this. And so I'm going to take it a step further and hopefully not confuse things even more and just talk about what are some of the trends, what is responsible investing, remind the fiduciaries on the call of what their responsibilities are more specifically when it comes time to look at investment options, and just kind of share a couple parting thoughts with you. So what is responsible investing? It's been around for a long time. And in fact, it's a trend that started decades ago, predominantly with institutional investors. So think about a faith-based organization that might want to exclude, certain sectors or companies, that might be at odds with their beliefs or morals. Maybe a healthcare organization that wants to exclude tobacco companies from their portfolio. And that was really the genesis behind responsible investing, and it's evolved. It's evolved in kind of two ways. One, the types of institutions that are considering it, and then two, the vehicles and the strategies and the styles upon which it is implemented. More and more higher education, private nonprofits, and as we just heard, potentially retirement funds are showing more and more interest in the space. And what I'll go through with you here in a minute is just the evolution of how this responsible investing framework has evolved to where it is today. But before I get there, close to $1 in $3 that are invested across the globe are in what many would consider to be ESG or responsible investing type strategies. We'll expand upon that a little bit later, because ESG and responsible investing is not an all or none type of approach. And so it's certainly commanded a lot of assets, but in the retirement space, it's been fairly slow, and the growth and the usage is quite small, as you can see. Only 4.7% of retirement plan sponsors have used or are using a specific investment in their plan, and that's less than 0.5% of all plan assets. So very low adoption as of the dates of these studies. What I want to talk to you about, though, quickly, is the evolution, or at least where this spectrum of responsible investing sits today. And what you can see in the bottom half of this page here is that traditionally, like I mentioned, the more exclusionary factors, those still exist today. They've been around for a long time. There's still gray area around these exclusionary types of strategies. What constitutes, a company that maybe manufactures tobacco versus selling it? Is that good or bad? Should that be included or excluded? So there's some gray area, but generally in this exclusionary space, investment results as well as that collateral benefit are much easier to measure. In the integration or the ESG space, where investment strategies are looking to maybe proactively invest in companies that are helping the environment or have good governance practices. Those types of strategies, as you can imagine, are going to have a little more variability around them, both in terms of what they think is important to emphasize within their strategy, and then also how you interpret whether or not those factors are additive to the potential return of the strategy over a long period of time. So as we'll see here in a little bit, those become a little bit more difficult to measure, and not only the performance, but also, are they doing good? Are they actually achieving some sort of collateral benefit alongside the returns? The impact investing on the right here is really a very focused type of strategy. Typically, these types of investments are a little more concentrated, and they're focused very narrowly towards one or two potential benefits. So here we show a climate change or food systems, where maybe the investment is specifically targeted to a certain part of the world to help with those types of factors. And we would say that because those are more complex and more specific, those typically are going to be used not in a broad type of sense for a retirement plan, but generally for institutions that have where those things align with their specific mission. So does ESG result in better performance and outcomes for the participant? Before we get there, I just want to mention a couple things regarding fiduciary governance priorities. Ed and team have already done a good job of kind of explaining and reiterating what these things are, but I wanted to make a couple points. Ultimately, the job of a retirement plan sponsor, one of the many jobs, but one of the more important, is not necessarily to pick the best investments or the lowest cost investments every single time. Instead, the job is to make available and monitor a wide array of investments that provide your participants with the tools to make decisions and diversify their portfolio to help them achieve their investment objectives. That's going to, of course, include different styles, different asset classes, investments with a varying array of risk and return type of characteristics. And so ultimately, what we believe at Clearstead and what we work with our clients to do is to create a structure, a governance structure around that helps to document the reasons for selecting an investment, the cadence upon which those will be evaluated, the metrics and the standards upon which they will be evaluated. And as you can all imagine, that's done through investment policy and very important guidelines that are established throughout that process. We would say that regardless of what direction the trend of ESG goes within retirement plans, is that every investment should be subjected to the same standards and the same set of criteria, regardless of what its asset class may be, its objectives may be, or whether or not it's oriented through a responsible investing lens or not. And so if you'll go to the next page, I want to talk about a little bit the two paths to selecting and evaluating an investment. On the next page, you'll see on the left-hand side a set of criteria. This is a very high-level example type criteria of what you would all be very familiar with evaluating the investments in your plan lineup against. How is that investment performing against broad markets? What are the fees? How much risk is it taking? Is there confidence around that strategy's ability to continue to perform well? Is there stability within the team? All of those types of characteristics that we're often familiar with evaluating when it comes to evaluating an investment. Those are certainly important, whether it's a responsible investing type investment or not. And so what I would attest to you is that that's probably a little bit easier to evaluate and measure, because often those things are a little more black and white. On the right-hand side, though, and this I think will apply to any sort of responsible investing fund, whether you're an endowment, a pension, or you do include this in a defined contribution plan at some point, is that collateral benefit? Is it actually occurring? And so that will become more difficult to measure, because in a lot of ways, some of it will be subjective. Data may not be available. The outcome may not be agreed upon by everyone who evaluates that outcome. And so it will become more difficult, more opaque to measure those. But what we believe is that in identifying those types of strategies, it's important to do the due diligence and know whether or not that strategy has the tools and the wherewithal to measure and report and communicate to its investors whether or not it's achieving that secondary benefit or actually doing good. On the next page, the question we always get is, do these investments perform? And the answer is, well, yes, some of them do, and no, some of them don't. But it's a really mixed bag, and it's hard to put your finger on one yes or no answer as to whether or not these responsible investment strategies perform, because they are very different. If they were all the same, it would be pretty easy, but they all have different objectives. They all have different ways of which they evaluate ESG factors or exclude companies and include others. So not surprisingly, the investment returns are kind of all over the board. And so what we advise our clients, kind of the bottom line is, if you want to make an investment in an ESG related or socially responsible related area, it's important to first measure what financial objective you're trying to achieve, and hold that investment accountable to the same standards as you would one that would not have a responsible tilt to its strategy, for example. And so we think that to be, the fiduciary North Star, or the way upon which those investments should be considered. Before I conclude, just on a couple of thoughts, I wanted to share a couple of things. And I mentioned this earlier. ESG, responsible investing, it's not an all or nothing type of approach. There are investments, like we just saw on the prior page, that really focus on those types of things, exclusionary factors or governance type factors. But there are other funds, and in fact, 3 of the top 10 investments used in 401ks across the universe, I won't use their names, but 3 of the top 10, they're not ESG specific strategies, but they incorporate what they would call financially material ESG factors in their investment process. So it's becoming more germane to the industry. What would be a financially material factor? Well, it would be something like evaluating the governance structure of that organization, or are they environmentally safe? Are they potentially going to have an environmental issue down the road, and we would not want to invest with them? So it's out there. They're all very wise things to consider. And I think that if you were to look through and ask your investment professionals that help you with your retirement plans today, ask them which of your investments include some of those factors. I think you might be surprised to see how many of those managers actually are already incorporating some of that decision making into their investment process. I'm going to conclude just real quickly before I hand things back to Thompson Hine. Just as a reminder, this is the fiduciary good hygiene when you're considering which investments to include in your lineup and how to evaluate them. I won't read these points to you, but other just kind of emphasize the importance of have guidelines, process documented in your policy, follow those guidelines. Ask your investment fiduciaries to document and show you evidence of why you're still in compliance with those things. And most times, more times than not, being able to demonstrate that is going to lead to fiduciary best practices. So Laura, Ed, I'll pause there, hand things back to you guys.
Thanks, Mike. We did have a question come in, and I think I'll read it and maybe give my thoughts on it. And then if Mike or Ed, you have anything to add, feel free. It's a good question. Given the growth in assets in ESG related funds, and despite the relatively modest take-up in plans subject to ERISA, with the 2022 stock market downturn, have we seen litigation involving ESG, i.e. that adding an ESG investment in an ERISA plan was imprudent, or conversely, using an ESG fund with above average returns as a measure of damages, presumably, I think, for not including, an ESG fund. So, we've seen litigation either, alleging that it was a breach of fiduciary duty to add an ESG investment to the lineup, or to not have an ESG investment option in the lineup. And I will say that I'm not aware of any actual complaints that have included that theory. That's not to say that they aren't out there, but it definitely is something that we are very concerned, is coming. And we didn't really touch on this during the presentation, but ERISA litigation and litigation that is centered around alleged breaches of fiduciary duty by fiduciaries with responsibility, specifically over 401k plans and 401k plan investment lineups, has been at a very high level for a long time. And there is much of this litigation out there. The theories continue to evolve. We see new theories, changing ones, some of the same old ones, and it probably is not going to be long before this gets added, to the plaintiffs' bar's list of challenges. issues that they're at least alleging, constituted a breach of fiduciary duty, almost, either way, if you add it or you don't. Ed, anything to add to that, or are you aware of any litigation?
I'm not aware of any litigation specifically on that point, but I would agree with you. I think you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? There's always going to be a possibility of litigation, and we know there's lots of great plaintiffs' attorneys out there looking for angles to pursue claims. I would say it really underscores the need to put in place that prudent process, right? And to partner, if your named fiduciary, if your committee, if your company doesn't have the necessary expertise, you really need to partner with a group like a ClearStep or another registered investment advisor to help you sort through those factors. Because again, I think it's very easy to play Monday morning quarterback, right, and pick apart investment if they don't perform as well as somebody hoped they might. And that's, again, why we have to control what we can control and put in place those processes. But no, Laura, I'm not aware of any specific cases at this point.
Yeah. Another question, good question, before I move to the external factors and pressures is, and this is, by the way, one of the external factors and pressures, right, is risk that participants are going to challenge the decisions made by fiduciaries as it relates to, selection of ESG funds or use or non-use of ESG related criteria in evaluating the funds offered in a 401k plan lineup. So this falls right in line with where we're going to go next. But another question, would I be in a more defensible position if I limited access to ESG investments through the directed brokerage account, with appropriate disclosure? So what this person is talking about, for those that might not be familiar, 401k plans can have as an option, not all do, but some of them do have this brokerage account option, self-directed brokerage account option, where participants can opt out of investing within the what's called core lineup and move into the self-directed brokerage account and basically invest in a much wider array. Sometimes there are still some limitations on it of available investment options out there on the market. And that is something that we might suggest to clients that have that feature available and that are getting inquiries from participants about how can I, get access to ESG themed investments. One way to do that might be through the self-directed brokerage option. I do think that is less riskier than adding an ESG fund within the core lineup, but it still, I would say, is not without risk. And again, something we didn't really touch on in this program, but we do believe that at some point, the Department of Labor is going to take a much closer look and potentially issue regulations directly impacting and affecting self-directed brokerage accounts and fiduciary responsibility as it relates to oversight of investments that are available through self-directed brokerage. We're not there yet. We don't have that on the books right now, but based on some, comments made by the Department of Labor in a number of different contexts, we do have some concern that that's another shoe to drop at some point in the future. Again, Ed, anything to add there?
Yeah, I would just say along those lines, Laura, you're right. We know that Department of Labor kind of dipped its toe into this back in 2012, right, when we had the participant fee disclosure guidelines and Q&As come out, where one of the Q&As talked about this, right? If sufficient numbers of your participants are investing in a particular fund within that brokerage window, it may become an investment alternative within the plan, right? And you may have obligations to monitor that fund, right? And then quickly after all sorts of market participants said, hold on a second, this is really expanding fiduciary obligations beyond what we've understood them to be. They actually withdrew it, right? They said issued a corrective. But I think you're right. I think the writing's on the wall that there is going to be increased scrutiny over brokerage windows in the future, and it's not a bulletproof option to do this. And then you also face the flip side, right? We said damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you don't evaluate your investments based on some of these factors material, then you're opening yourself up to risk from that.
Okay. Let's move on to some of these external factors and pressures. And the first one that I just wanted to make, everyone that's listening in here aware of is if you're a public company that sponsors a 401k plan, you might find yourself having to, address proxy proposals. So we have seen several public companies where shareholders were successful in getting a proposal included in the company's proxy statement. The proposal, if it had been approved by the shareholders, and would have required a lot of different, disclosures and actions by the board, but we were kind of focused on the aspect of this proposal that would have impacted 401k plans. It would have required the board to prepare a report reviewing the company's retirement plan investment options and provide an assessment as to how those options align with the company's climate action goals. And just looking at that, there are a number of things that jump out. One, it's not usually the board of a public company that has any, responsibility or very little, responsibility day to day for the oversight of the investment options within the 401k plans. It's very common for that responsibility to be delegated, by the board to a fiduciary committee. The second thing that jumps out is, how those options align with the company's climate action goals. Well, as you just heard Ed talk about for 20 minutes, that's not the way in which a fiduciary of an ERISA governed plan is supposed to be evaluating the investment options that are offered to the plan participants. It's not evaluating them for alignment with company goals, right? It's evaluating them for alignment with ERISA's duty of loyalty to act solely in the best interest of plan participants and beneficiaries. So very problematic had these proposals been approved by the shareholders. At least so far. On the next page, I don't think any of these types of proposals have actually received shareholder approval. You do have the shareholders in these cases noting that the plan's investment options seem to contradict the company's stated climate reduction commitment, raising reputational risk, this whole greenwashing concept. Again, I think that's debatable, but that's what the shareholders were alleging. In each of those cases, the company sought permission from the SEC to exclude the proposal, but the SEC declined, which was also kind of an important development. Again, ultimately the shareholders did not vote in favor of these proposals, but I think it's probably safe to say that these are not going to go away. They're not going to, these proposals aren't going to cease. They're going to continue and, may receive, shareholder approval at some point as it relates to some of these companies. The other sort of external pressures that you see are in connection with ESG surveys. So many companies are required or choose to respond to surveys conducted by ESG rating organizations. So this is an organization that's, going to provide a rating for the company, an ESG rating applicable to the organization, the corporation. Some of these surveys include questions about the investment options offered under the company's retirement plans and whether and how these options incorporate ESG criteria and or reasons for not incorporating ESG criteria into the selection criteria. So just be aware that, these questions could be asked. You'll have to provide an answer. they can be very difficult to respond to because you're, typically under pressure from the folks that are responsible for ESG initiatives within the corporation to provide results that the surveying organization is going to view as favorable. So you can't just say, no, we don't consider, and no, we don't include, and, mind your own business. That's not going to go over well. So they do require very careful analysis and responses. And at the end of the day, truthful responses. So be on the lookout for that and be prepared, to respond to those types of surveys. Also, fiduciaries will receive almost certainly pressure from, various members of company management who are under pressure to meet ESG related goals, asking fiduciaries whether or how they might be contributing to these goals when it comes to selecting investments for the company's retirement plans. The people that are making these inquiries are not going to have probably any even baseline understanding of ERISA, all the different concepts that Ed covered during the first part of this presentation. And so oftentimes, time is spent just sort of educating the inquirer about, no, we're not taking this into account, or maybe we are, and here's how, but, there's limits to this, and here's what those limits are, fiduciary duties and responsibilities under ERISA. And then also participant inquiries, and we kind of touched on this in answering the question about the litigation, participant inquiries, participant claims, participant litigation. But you're almost certainly going to have, depending on the size of your plans, you're almost certainly going to encounter one or more plan participants who are pro ESG, who are asking questions like, are any of these funds ESG funds? If they're not, why not? What are you looking at? Are you considering this as a criteria committee when you're evaluating the investment options? And then, of course, you're going to have plan participants who are anti-ESG, wanting to make sure you're not taking ESG into account at all in evaluating the investment options. Again, these types of inquiries can be really difficult, to respond to. And I think, in general, the approach I like to take is to focus more on sort of describing the process that you use to select investments and try as much as possible to, avoid talking specifically or addressing, specifically this question about, ESG. The final kind of outside pressure is state laws and of course politics. Some states have enacted laws that prevent or just discourage fiduciaries of public pension funds from using ESG factors in their investing strategy. Some states have taken the exact opposite approach and are leading public pension plans in their states in an opposite direction. And while these state laws are not directly applicable to ERISA governed plans, state public pension funds are not subject to ERISA. And state laws don't apply to, private company ERISA governed plans. It is nonetheless a debate that's taking place in the public eyes and ears and playing out in front of individuals who are participants in ERISA governed plans. So, this is where they get the idea to ask these questions of fiduciaries regarding investment options being offered in the plan. So I think, none of this is easy, unfortunately, but the takeaway from all of these external pressures is you can't put your head in the sand, right? Like, you have to sort of know and understand and be prepared for inquiries coming from any of these directions. And in order to do that, you have to make sure that the fiduciaries of the plan have been educated on this topic, have been educated on the rules and regulations, have, engaged the experts to help them with this analysis, experts like Clearstead, and have a well sort of documented process for evaluating the investment options and, the use of ESG factors in that evaluation. I've actually lost my question box here. I was going to look to see if I have any more questions, and okay, I got it back up. I don't see, let's see, any more questions. Any other comments from either Mike or Ed to wrap around things out here?
Well, I would just add that I echo the sentiment that it's a big can of worms that gets opened. The topic covers a lot of potentially sensitive areas and gray areas, and so if it helps, what we have found is, like anything else in life, just talking it through with your committee, your trusted, fiduciaries, taking your time, asking the experts, and just knowing that you're not going at it alone. Everyone else is kind of trying to figure this out. You find some comfort in that.
Well said, Mike.
All right. As a reminder, and again, if there's any questions, there's still time, but there is CLE for today's program, and the code that you will need is TH7917. T as in Tom, H as in Harry, 7917. Also, if you're not currently receiving updates and invitations, we invite you to our webinars and to our bulletins. We're offering a lot of programs and information on the ESG topic specifically. We also have a separate mailing list for employee benefit related topics and developments. You can go to the Thompson Hine website and register to receive any of our mailings under the Insights section of the webinar. Thank you all for your interest and for attending today's program.